I'm David Shipley, and this is Impromptu with Washington Post Opinions. And this week, we have another bonus episode that's part of a series we've been running called Who is Government?, where 7 amazing writers find somebody or something in the federal government that's indispensable. Michael Lewis, author of Moneyball, The Big Short, and The Fifth Risk, recruited these writers and is talking to all of them about the stories they discovered. Today's conversation is with John Lanchester, author of Fragrant Harbor and Capital and other wonderful works. And it's not about a person, but a thing. Inflation. Enjoy.
This is Michael Lewis, curator of this series, Who is Government? And my guest today is John Lanchester, old friend, glorious writer, who instantly sprung to mind when this series was conceived because I love everything he writes. He's one of these writers who can kind of make nonfiction sing on the page, but also is a wonderful novelist. Anyway, he's written a piece for us, and here's John and I talking about it last week. Hey.
How you doing?
Well, the series has just gone boom.
Oh, great.
So I call you and ask you to participate in this quixotic project, and you didn't even really hesitate very much. You said yes. And you're the only one who's writing in the series who's not writing about his own country. Why'd you bother?
It was such an immediately appealing idea. I think I've always been fascinated by structures and systems and the difficulties of telling stories about them. It really struck me as a thing about the modern world that we're not very well equipped to deal with the idea, because we think in terms of heroes and individual agencies and stories about people, but a lot of the big stories aren't really about people. They're about systems. And that's why I was so immediately tempted, because the idea of writing about these big structural forces mediated through government is interesting both in and of itself and also as a kind of technical challenge.
Tell us just a little bit about your piece, what the idea of it is.
The idea of it is that the hero of the piece is a number. The hero of the piece is the CPIU, which is the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers. And it's the number that's plugged into all sorts of federal government benefits and calculations. And it even turns up in things like divorce settlements that are linked, uprated linked to the CPIU. It's an incredibly important central number. And I just got really interested in it as a way of writing about all the different things that government does, all the varieties of life, really, you get compressed and squeezed and modulated and tried to reduce, summed up in one single number. And that I've really tried to tell the story of this one number.
When did you become aware of just how much the United States government counts?
I think really it came out of the pandemic. One of the things that happened in the pandemic when states did well and less well, a thing, you were very conscious of, and it was mediated in the most basic, starkest way possible by how many people were dying, how many people were living, how many people were getting treatment. It made me think a lot about, well, actually at the most basic level, what states are for. The simplest thing it has to do is to deliver a better quality of life for its citizens. If you're not better off living in a state than outside of it, why do we have states at all? To be honest, I never really thought much about, what can the state do? What are the limits of its abilities? And that thing about counting was really thrown into relief, I think, by the pandemic. That thing about, it actually became very important to know actually how many people do have this thing. Where are they? What are the outcomes when they get sick? Who is the people who are getting sick? Who are the people who are recovering? And also bluntly, crudely, what does it cost? All of those things, from being a kind of very boring thing that we could very happily never think about, suddenly became not metaphorically matters of life and death. And that for me was when I got interested in this thing of, just what states count.
You point out at the beginning of the piece that this act of counting isn't just sort of incidental to the United States government. It's actually central to the founding of the country.
Yeah, it's right. The enumeration clause of the Constitution. I think the US, apart from being, I think, the first written constitution, it's also, I think, the only one that has, certainly the first one that has counting actually built right into it because of the way that Congress is set up. Counting isn't some footnotey thing that the US government does. It's actually part of what the US government is. It's the entity that counts its citizens and lots of other stuff too.
And even compared to other governments, we count quite a bit.
It's actually nuts when you start looking into, the point where I had to sort of sit down and turn away from the screen was selenium content in wild turkey meat, 2 different types, white and dark, raw and cooked. And I remember thinking, wow, those feds, they really do count quite a lot of stuff, and, flavor contents in olive oil and, average and median wages for all sorts of jobs in all sorts of different states. And the amount of information that comes through from the federal government, I think it just has absolutely no precedent anywhere in the world.
You have written wonderful novels and wonderful works of nonfiction. How do you decide when you're approaching a subject which way you're going to tilt with it? Like whether this is a work of nonfiction or this is a work of fiction that you've got?
Usually, if I can explain why it's interesting, it's nonfiction. Fiction is the stuff that you kind of can't stop thinking about and sort of stays with you and you can't quite explain it. And nonfiction journalism, the whole point is to shed light and make it open and to tell the story. And when there's something interesting about the world that I want to communicate, that seems much more naturally to be a non-fiction thing. I think it'd be challenging to write a novel about the consumer price index.
I mean, where would the romantic interest be?
Yeah, exactly.
There'd be conflict with other statistics, but it's unclear whether there'd be attraction.
I wrote a non-fiction book about the credit crunch and the financial crisis. I was writing a novel set in London at that point, and I sort of accidentally found out quite a lot about the workings of finance and all that stuff. And and while I was writing it, the world blew up and all that stuff happened. And I wrote a non-fiction book about partly to quarantine all the research because I realised otherwise, if I wasn't careful, I'd be having to as Nigel looked over towards the lights of the financial district gleaming in the distance, he struggled to remember the definition of a collateralized debt obligation. And I wrote the non-fiction to kind of quarantine and preserve the reader from that kind of explanation. Because you can do a lot of things in fiction, but you can't really explain.
So, last question. You refer to the darkening at the end of your piece. What is the darkening?
Last few years, I've been more and more struck by this thing about sometimes called the post-truth moment. There was a kind of grounding in a collective understanding about what's true and what isn't. That there was a commonality of, what facts are, what's real and what isn't. And that we're losing some traction with that our societies are slipping away from the idea that if you're caught in a falsehood, that once upon a time, if you were caught lying in public, you couldn't have a career in public life. We seem to have lost that. And it seems to be accompanied by an increasing tendency to just simply reject things that are inconveniently true. And I wonder if one of the things it looks like is a sort of end of an enlightenment moment, because you can't demonstrate objective truth, but you can keep looking for it. That's one of the things that the CPI is for. It's an impossible number, but the work to make it is what's important. And if you abandon the idea that you can establish these sort of independent, factually grounded truths, it is a turn in human history, I think. And I chose to call it the darkening as a sort of parallel to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment gets a lot of criticism now, correctly, for the ideas that it's grounded in, norms that erase all sorts of important truths about cultural differences and racial differences and kind of hierarchies of race and power. At the same time, there is something very important about that idea that you can live better by knowing better. And that's something I call the darkening, that I think we're starting to see these alarming signs of, and that don't really have a historic parallel, I don't think. The idea of a society collectively abandoning the idea of truth and then snapping out of it. And I think we have to hope that's what's going to happen now.
On that note, John Lanchester, I want to send the audience off to read your piece. It's wonderful. And like everything you write, makes my heart go pitter-patter when I see the words on the page. It's just great.
Well, thank you so much for asking me to do it, Michael. It was, it was a privilege.
We'll put links in our show notes to John Lanchester's full article and the 3 others that have been published so far in the Who is Government series. This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and edited by Millie Mitra and Allison Michaels. It was mixed by Emma Munger. As always, tell us what you think by emailing impromptu@washpost.com. Thanks a lot.